Thank you, Candace, for that really interesting presentation. I'm still thinking about it. And thanks to the CIFAR group and all of you for having me here. It's a pleasure to share some of my work. What I thought I would do is present the results of two studies, both of which speak to a different aspect of what it is that we think neighborhoods might be able to do, or what we might be able to do at the neighborhood level in terms of improving the lives of children. And what I'm going to focus on is the role of institutions in this process, and I'm specifically going to focus on the role of childcare centers as institutions in this process, particularly because childcare centers are the kinds of institutions for which we have a preset, actually many of you probably don't, but many people in general have a preset understanding of what it is that a childcare center is supposed to be doing, namely taking care of kids. It turns out that by just expanding our conception of what the institution is and our conception of who the people we're trying to serve are, we can actually develop a much richer understanding of what it is that these institutions do, and therefore how it is that we can use them if we're interested in improving child well-being. I'm going to make three very simple points, all having to do with the relationship between social capital and everything we care about in this conference. One is that social capital can help mothers and children, not just children, and in fact, the majority of the results I'm going to show you today are about parents, not about kids, on purpose. Second, that social capital can be shaped by organizations such as childcare centers. We tend to think about social capital in light of the difference between formal and informal organizations. So formal organizations are institutions, they're formal. Informal networks are the domain typically of social capital, which is people's friends, acquaintances, family members, and so on. And we think about the informal realm as the realm that we actually can't regulate or manage. Right? We can run an organization, but we tend to think of informal friends as, you can't force people to be friends with one another. I'm actually going to show you evidence that's not quite consistent with that idea. I think you can actually structure organizations in ways that make it likely that people will willfully want to form ties that end up being very helpful for them. And that therefore, strategic interventions at the organizational level can actually mobilize the power of social capital in ways that end up benefiting both the organization and the families. And lastly, I'm going to suggest that a lot of what we can do costs very little, but can potentially be quite high impact. In other words, it doesn't require a lot of expenditure, particularly in entities in the nonprofit world. And I see a couple of people being very happy about that particular part. It can actually be done with very, very little cost and a potentially significant impact. And I'm going to show you a study of that as well. So, quick outline. First, I'm going to tell you what I mean by social capital, which is a term that I think everybody here has heard. And I'm sure everyone here could offer a definition, each of which would be different from all of the others, which is also the case in academia. And then I'm going to present one study that is just about well-being. That is the core outcome of interest in that study. In other words, a study in which I show the relationship between social capital and greater well-being at the parent or household level. And just a second study in which I show the impact of, again, mobilizing social capital, here in particularly in something we all care about, which is the attendance rate in childcare centers, particularly Head Start centers, aimed at improving child educational outcomes. And then I'll discuss implications. That's it. A lot of what you're going to see is published in a book titled Unanticipated Gains, Origins of Network Inequality in Everyday Life, that was published by Oxford University Press in 2009. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through a couple of findings. And if you're skeptical, I can promise you that I will not say anything I don't believe pretty firmly, unless I say I don't believe this pretty firmly. And secondly, I promise you that if you want more data, they're in the book. But also, if you have questions, I'm happy to take them, but I just don't want to give you the impression that I know I'm going to be glossing over some things, and I don't want to give you the impression that I am glossing over them because the evidence is not there. I'm glossing over them because there's not a lot of time. Okay, so what is social capital? By social capital, all I mean are the resources that you derived from your social networks. Notice I didn't say that social capital is your networks. Your networks are your networks. The social capital is the stuff that you get from their networks. And what is that stuff? I'm speaking specifically about three things. One is information. A second is social support. and a third is the reinforcement of norms. That's it, okay? Information, social support, and the enforcement of norms. The idea being, if I have access to a network, that network can have more or less information that's useful for me. It can, but it may not, be a social support, and it can, or it may not, reinforce my norms. That is it, okay? Later I'm going to show you how that conception particularly matters, but I just want to be clear exactly on what I mean. Okay, the two studies. The first study is a look at the impact of social capital, and an associational look at the impact of social capital on well-being. By well-being, I mean specifically material hardship and mental hardship. This is again from the book. So just to put this in context, I think just about everybody here could reproduce some version of this by memory. Over the last 40, 50 years, what we've seen is a dramatic increase in the labor for participation of women, and a concomitant increase in the proportion of in the proportion of 3- and 4-year-olds who are in nursery, preschool, or kindergarten. These data are from the United States. The first study, actually both studies are based on the United States data because that is where I am based, but there's some version of a very similar pattern, I'm certain of this, in Canada. Okay, this is actually not a surprise, but it's quite important to think about this in the context of a larger demographic trend. This is not something that just popped up out of nowhere. More people have their younger children in a childcare center, preschool, kindergarten, Head Start, or some similar institutional organizational context. The first study, the study is based on multiple kinds of data, including a nationally representative, again, U.S. nationally representative survey of 3,500 mothers. This is the Fragile Families Child and Wellbeing Study, if you're interested. These are mothers who were followed from the birth of the child, of the focal child, to age 5 in this particular set of findings I'm going to show you. So what the study researchers did is they went to hospitals and they sampled children being born at the hospital, and they followed both the mother and the father. And the reason they did that is because it turns out that for a lot of unmarried mothers, particularly low-income unmarried mothers who were oversampled in this study, one of the few times you will actually find the father is in the hospital when the child is born. Right? It's actually, just as a logistical survey issue, a lot harder to find fathers at the time, so they did find them at that time. And anyway, what happens is they were interviewed at birth, again when the child was 1, again when the child was 3, again when the child was 5, and then again several years after that. Okay, so this longitudinal data. And I'm going to focus, just for the sake of this presentation, and also for the sake of the book, on the mothers, for reasons that will become clear in a minute. And the question is really simple. You're a mother and you have a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old. Did enroll in the childcare center in a center have an impact on social capital? That's it. In other words, did it have an impact on the networks that you had and the stuff that you got out of the networks? And secondly, did it improve your well-being? That's it. So for those of you who have had children, you can think about the time, maybe that's now, when your children were just born, and you had a decision to make, either I put my child in a childcare center or don't. Was there any benefit in terms of those outcomes in putting the child in a childcare center? Some descriptive data. This is the number of friends that mothers made in the childcare center. By the way, I should say this before I continue. I'm going to show you the quantitative data, but this study is actually based on a great deal of fieldwork data in New York as well. We went to 4 neighborhoods, 1 predominantly black, 1 predominantly white, 1 predominantly Latino, the 3 of them poor, and 1 racially mixed but mostly white upper middle class neighborhoods. And we visited and did observations and interviews with all childcare centers in those 4 neighborhoods. This is 24 centers in total. And we interviewed also a subset of mothers in depth from those centers, about 65 or 70 mothers in depth. So some of the things I'm going to discuss, you'll see I'm not showing you data, and those things are based on the in-depth interviews. Okay. So this is from the survey data. We just asked all of those mothers who had a child in a childcare center, do you have a friend who you met in the center? That's it. And what you're seeing is that 60% of mothers made 1 or more friends. Okay? But here's the more important question. Did enrolling your child in a center increase the number of friends you had? So we asked everybody, whether in a center or not, how many close friends do you have? There was some version of this question. This was not the exact wording. And what we did is we ran a regression, and this is the negative binomial regression. Basically, we predicted the number of friends after adjusting for all of the obvious things: income, race, age, education, the number of kids you have, number of adults in the household, employment, and a whole bunch of other factors. And the question is, did mothers who have their child in a childcare center have more friends than comparable mothers by all of the observable measures we could think of who had a child the same age but whose child was not in the childcare center? And what you see is there is an effect. All right, so about one more close friend, which makes a difference because closer friends for many kinds of social support are more likely sources of social support than non-close friends. And you see an effect. Did it make a difference? So what you're seeing here is the first outcome in terms of well-being. The question, remember I mentioned two well-being related outcomes. One was material hardship and one was mental hardship. The mental hardship measure is a simple set of items from the medical diagnostic handbook that I'm sure you all know. I see somebody nodding, whatever it's called. There's a pretty psychometrically robust set of indicators for depression, and the idea is if you answer enough of them at a certain rate, you're classified as medically depressed. That's it. So the questionnaire was in the Fragile Families Survey, and that is the outcome. And the question is, how much lower are the odds of being depressed for a mother who enrolled in a childcare center and made a friend there when compared to a mother who did not enroll in a childcare center or who enrolled but didn't make a friend there? And this is what you're seeing. What you're seeing on the left is the impact on poor mothers, and on the right for non-poor mothers. What you're seeing, for example, is that for poor mothers, the odds of being depressed are 10%, about 15% lower if you're in a center but you didn't make any actual friends that you would consider a close friend. If you did, the odds are 40% lower when compared to the mother, identical in every way we could observe, who did not enroll in a childcare center, and after adjusting for the prior depression in the earlier wave of the survey before you enrolled in your child in a childcare center. So for those of you interested, these are lag-dependent variable models, so they're actually pretty reasonably robust. So if there's any aspect of depression that is latent and consistent across a life course, or consistent over this period, we are adjusting for that as well. Okay? For non-poor mothers, there's also a strong effect, and you can see it actually is pretty consistent. The second item was material hardship, and the question is again, how much lower is the predictive hardship score when compared to mothers whose child is not in a center? Again, these are all mothers of children the same age. The hardship score is a standard score in the current population survey. It has a number of items that measure literally your difficulty beyond or outside of just what we consider poverty. So you went hungry because you couldn't afford enough to eat. You had your electricity cut off because you didn't pay the bills. You were evicted, etc. There's a number of outcomes, and this is just a simple score. And what you're seeing is that for mothers, enrolling in a center, regardless of whether you made friends, has an impact on the predicted hardship score. For non-poor mothers, it also has an impact, but only if you made friends there. And I'm happy to talk about that difference. The bottom line, enrolling a kid in a center does affect the social capital, I believe, of mothers. And that social capital makes a difference in terms of material hardship and mental hardship that we can observe. Second study is an experimental study. And for the second study, what we're looking at is on the impact of social capital on attendance. This is among Head Start centers. Head Start centers, I think everybody here knows, are centers aimed at building community, improving education, and preparing 3- and 4-year-olds from low-income backgrounds for kindergarten. Okay? This is work with a large team, and actually this paper has just been published, and I don't have the citation here, but if you send me an email, I'm happy to send it to you. And the question is, again, I should say, the reason attendance matters. I'm going to show you the figures in a moment, but attendance varies across centers, across Head Start centers. And in many Head Start centers, attendance is so low that children are essentially getting somewhere between 50 and 75% of the actual dosage, if you want to think about it that way, of the actual educational benefit they're supposed to be getting through the Head Start even in the best of circumstances, simply because they're not showing up. Okay? And I'm going to show you some figures for the particular center that we studied. So it's a real issue. I mean, if you think about it from an economic perspective, we've already paid for the slots. There's another kid who is not in that center because of that slot. And so attendance is actually a sort of a net loss low attendance is a net loss for everybody. We pay for it anyway, the kids don't show up, and therefore they don't get the educational preparation to that degree when it comes to starting. So the idea is, can we mobilize, I hate using the power of social capital, that's really what we're talking about. Can we mobilize social capital in such a way that we can reduce the attendance problems for the families that are having it? So we worked with a childcare center. This is a very large childcare center that's technically 3 separate childcare centers, 3 separate Head Starts in the same space. This is a center that has a very strong parent engagement effort already. They're highly engaged with respect to attendance. There are lots of boards with parents. Parents are heavily involved. They know exactly what the lesson plan is. They know exactly what the kids are going to eat every single day of the week. There's a daily schedule, so they know exactly what the kids are doing from the time they drop the kids off to the time they... So these are a center that's really already high engaged. It's engaged with parents. It does the things that Head Start centers are supposed to be doing, which is making sure that parents feel like they're part of the educational mission. And in that sense, it's actually a best case scenario. So the idea that we're working with is an idea sort of contrary to a service model. What's good about the Head Start centers is that this is a set of Head Start centers. We work with the large organization that runs them. This is a set of Head Start centers that's specifically interested in improving test scores. So it's not just in a general sort of, I want to improve kids' preparation for kindergarten. They're very, very much test score focused, very much metrics focused. Actually, the director is another graduate from Harvard Business School, the big CEO of the entire company. And so, and what they've done is they've thought, what we have to do is we have to work with the parents to make sure we're reaching the child, which of course makes a lot of sense. And so the idea is, how do we provide the right kinds of services to parents so that they become better parents to their children? Now notice that in that model, there are actually sort of 3 actors with respect to any given child: the center, the parent, and then the child. But if we go back to the social capital idea, what's powerful and useful about social capital in general is that there's potentially a context in which other parents can be a resource for improving the outcomes of your child. Now, what does this actually mean in practice? I found out the best way to talk about this is through a metaphor, or through an analogy, I should say. I recently decided I needed to, I turned an important age in the life course. I recently decided that it was important for me to start lifting weights. Because after this certain age, if you don't actually lift weights and engage in pretty serious strength resistance, you're going to have a hard time doing so. So I decided what I'm going to do, and the only way I can fit this is get up very early in the morning and start lifting weights before I go to the office. So I could decide to do this on my own. In other words, I could decide I'm going to set the alarm at 5:30, etc., hit the gym, do what I need to do, come back, and prepare for work. And I could do it. And notice that in this context, I'm actually highly motivated. I was the one who decided, as many parents are motivated in terms of improving the outcomes of their kids. And I've committed for, biological reasons or whatever you want to call them, that this is actually an important thing for me to do. Now imagine that instead of doing that, what I decided is I find a partner. I find somebody else who perhaps has reached that age as well, and who also has an interest in doing the same thing. What are the 3 things I get from having access to that network? Well, among other things, I can get, remember, information. That person can, figure out how to make sure you don't injure yourself through proper form so that you're screwed and not able to actually continue lifting for 2 months or whatever it is because you messed something up. It's just literally information. A second is support. Literally, you have a spotter, right? You can lift more and heavier and sort of attain greater gains if somebody's physically spotting you over the process of lifting weights. A third is the reinforcement of norms. If it's me, and I had a long night, like I flew back from Toronto at 9 o'clock at night, I'm probably going to, it's quite easy to be like, you know what? I think I'm just going to skip it today. I'll make it up next week. I'll do double. I see some heads nodding. But if I know somebody else is going to be there, that raises the stakes for me. It's a reinforcement of the norm. There are actually three very, very different mechanisms through which having the access to the networks, in other words, three different forms of social capital that are going to improve the odds that I'm going to succeed at the thing that I already decided for myself was important for me to do. This is actually quite important. There's often a conversation among the poor, there's a sort of culture of poverty conversation that presumes the core issue of, well, if they only wanted it badly enough, they would get it. Or I just gave you an example where I wanted it because I just decided that it was time, and yet even in that context, having the support actually makes an enormous difference. The idea is to do a version of the same thing with respect to attendance. We had done some pilot studies where we found that the reasons parents were, we just focus groups, the reasons parents were not showing up often with their kids had nothing to do with the sense that it was not important for them to do so. Everybody had a version of the same thing I just said with respect to weightlifting. Everybody thought, it's really important. I got to get the kids ready. I know if they're not ready, they're going to suffer in school. The schools aren't that good enough anyway, but this is a great opportunity. It was all practical issues. Older kid got sick, and I needed to stay home, or I had some commitment out of town, or I didn't have anybody to take the kid in this morning when I got sick. It was all practical issues of the kind that networks actually could very easily resolve, or the kind that many of us would otherwise resolve by just paying a babysitter or having the father or the mother in that case. It was almost always mothers in this context. In other words, by getting access to the social capital in our own networks. So what we did is we designed, and this is for the result. So this is the average attendance rate by month over the course of the year. What would happen is, come September when kids enrolled, everybody showed up. And then as it got colder, and the bus routes started getting less reliable, and there was a storm that delayed everything, etc., come February, it averaged to about 75. For some kids, it was as low as 50%. Right? So for those months, literally just getting half the dosage that's already paid for, and the slot's already there, just sitting empty. And then it would climb up again as, the bus routes became more reliable again, and the weather got better, and then it did, but it never reached the 90% threshold. So the question is, can we do that any better through a childcare center-based intervention? So what we did is we did a randomized control trial where this was a center that had, I think, 24 classrooms. And what we did is a third of the classrooms were assigned to a different condition. A third of the kids were the control room, which means that when you came with your parent to sign up your kid, you were just assigned to a classroom at random, one of the 8 at random. For a third of the classrooms, you were assigned to a classroom with other parents from your same neighborhood. So we had taken the prior year's data and identified what the core neighborhoods, but neighborhoods not necessarily by name, but by physical space, as in who is coming from, for example, the same housing projects, or near whoever, or near what bus route. And the only idea was you were assigned to your neighborhood classroom, and at the beginning of the year, we told you, welcome everyone to class, just so all the parents know, all of the children in this classroom are from X neighborhood, and that was it. The third condition was the same thing, you were assigned to a neighborhood classroom, but we also did the following. We said, we're going to ask you to select an attendance, originally we called it attendance ally, but people didn't like the term, attendance buddy. We're going to, you got to do what people like. We're going to assign you to an attendance buddy. And all we only ask, but do not require that you select a buddy. Second, all we ask of your buddy is 2 things. If you're not going to come, just let your buddy know so the buddy can tell the teacher. And if your buddy asks you to bring their kid, do them the favor if you're able to. That's it. There's no money, there's no reward of any kind other than the center had already had attendance prizes anyway, years and years and years, little gold medals and things. So that stayed, but there were no special rewards for the attendance group. There was no special monetary incentive, and they also were not required to select an attendance buddy. We, at the beginning of the year, ran 2 or 3 parties, so little gatherings, pizza or whatever, like after the thing, so you could pick an attendance buddy, and that was it. The first result is, did it have an impact on social capital? The second is, did it have an impact on attendance? Here are the results for the impact of social capital. There are 3 columns because we ran the results with 3 different ways of constructing the population. The results are the same. For this part, the impact was the size of your social network, and I know it's not a great measure. There's more sophisticated and more complex measures in the paper. And what you're seeing is that this is the neighborhood only group. Basically what you're seeing here is that the impact was not statistically significant. In the attendance buddy group, what you're seeing is that you had about between a quarter or a third more people in your network if you were in this group than if you weren't, just at the end of the year. Everybody was interviewed in September and then again in May. So we just, by changing one simple rule, increase the social network of people without doing anything that cost any money. But the most important result for this particular conversation is the impact on attendance. So we can't control the weather. Everybody went down. But what you can see is that in the worst months, the control group had about a 70% attendance rate. That's in blue. The two experimental groups had between a 75 and an 80% attendance rate in the worst months. Meaning, depending on how you count, we cut attrition by about 7% in the worst months over the course of the year. And that was the pilot study. We actually didn't expect any results this easy. We hadn't tried anything out. We didn't know what would actually work. I'm quite certain that with a slightly more aggressive intervention, meaning we throw 4 parties instead of 3, or we say, hey, don't forget to find your attendance buddy, and a very small manipulation of incentives, we could easily bump this up. Notice it cost no money. There was no cost. There was no cost of any kind. Okay, to wrap up, mobilizing the social power of social capital, what I hope to convince you is that social capital is one of the things that we ought to consider a resource in the context of improving the lives of children. And that this resource is a resource that can be mobilized at the institutional level, even if you care about neighborhoods. Neighborhoods have local organizations. This is actually one of the indicators of high social organization in the neighborhood context. Local organizations are actually quite powerful tools that I think we underestimate in this context. I love that it's a low-cost model. It's actually one of the things one of the reasons social capital is called capital is because it's convertibility. You can do a lot of things that would otherwise cost you money. And finally, I'm hoping that this idea of thinking, even though we're focused on children, thinking about the family holistically also means thinking about children. So I hope I've convinced you of the importance of doing that as well. Thank you very much.